everyone. It's Traci. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know that this is part one of a two-part conversation. It's such a meaningful exchange, I didn't want to rush it. So we're taking our time. I hope you'll do the same. Thanks for being here. Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today's conversation is very personal for me. The very first death I ever witnessed was a friend named Colleen who had AIDS. We used to figure skate together in the 1990s, and I saw her almost every day. One afternoon, she invited me to her home and told me she had a secret, that she and her husband were HIV positive, and her husband was currently dying from AIDS-related complications. She kept her illness and his death private from almost everyone. I was the only person at the rink that knew, and this was a whole group of people that spent hours almost every day together. That experience affected me deeply, and it's part of why I do this work. We don't talk enough about what it means to live and to die with HIV or AIDS, not just historically, but now. People are aging with AIDS, people are dying, and too often they're not doing, and too often they're doing so quietly, overlooked, or without the care and dignity they deserve. Today, I'm honored to speak with Vince Crisostomo, a longtime HIV/AIDS activist and the director of aging services at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. Vince has been living with AIDS for nearly 40 years. His story offers not only a window into one person's journey, but a call to action for all of us. So grab a warm drink, find a comfortable seat, and join us for the conversation. Vince, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me. And I was very moved to hear your story.
Thank you. Thank you. I think about Colleen often. She was an amazing person.
Yeah, I can tell. I can hear that in your voice.
Can you Can we start and by having you take us back to when you were first diagnosed and what life was like then and what they told you or didn't tell you about what lay ahead?
Well, back in the day, meaning the 80s, when HIV was first making itself known, there was a rumor going around that Asians didn't get it. And I was living in New York. I was studying to be an actor, a singer, or a performer of some kind. And, when you're young, you don't think about certain things. And even though HIV was around, I really thought that I was safe. First, there was the rumor. Second, because of the scary time it was, I had abstained from having sex. And so I acquired HIV in 1986, but I didn't actually find out I had it until May of 1989. And at that time, I had developed what I thought was strep throat. I was living in New York. I didn't have health insurance, so I had to go to a public health clinic. And it was there that they did the intake. When they found out I was a gay man, they said, "Oh, we need to test you for HIV." And so there's a lot of details about that day and what that time was like. But basically, it ended, well, first with me thinking I wasn't going to come back to get the test results because I didn't think I'd had it. I would have it. And then me getting a card in the mail saying, yes, you need to come back to the clinic. And then them telling me, you need to come right away. And so I went and, I remember them going through talking about HIV, talking about AIDS, and just kind of talking. And I finally had to stop the doctor and said, you're scaring me. What's going on? Am I HIV positive or not? And then she kind of kept talking, and then she sort of blurted out, you're HIV positive. And she just kept talking. So I had to stop her and I said, what does that mean? And she told me, well, you've got the virus, which is believed to cause AIDS. And I said, never mind that. How long do I have to live? Because it was a death sentence at that time. And she said, most likely, I was 28. She said, most likely you won't live to see the age of 30. And so I had to, I wasn't sick other than that throat thing that I had. I was still the same person. And I guess I was just kind of stunned. I was the same person I was when I'd walked in 45 minutes before that. And I'd had the foresight to have a friend meet me. We were supposed to have lunch later, and I told him what was happening. He says, I'll come meet you at the clinic. I said, you can just wait, wait down the street and I'll come find you. Um, yeah, and so I was just stunned. And I remember them telling me, did you know you had it because you're handling this so well? And they kept saying you're handling this so well. People don't handle this so well. And I remember at one point just telling the person behind on the other side that, well, if I handle it well, I don't think it's because I handle it so well. I think you and your people handle it poorly. Um, it's kind of, if I knew then what I know now, then I would have been totally understandable why they were kind of shocked. Um, So anyway, they told me that, but I just turned 64 in February of this year, so I survived, and there's been a lot of living between that time in May of 1989 and now. And even just recently when I try not to I've often had to tell my story, but I don't always think about all the time frames. And just recently, well, actually, when we were preparing for this, I was going through the different timelines and some other things that I was doing. And I realized, oh my God, I actually acquired the person that I acquired HIV from. That was 1986, not 1987, which, that doesn't a year is not, but it's just funny how these things kind of play games with you.
It is amazing just the difference in time. And um, it's almost like now AIDS is out of the picture. People don't think about it. I mean, I remember I've done the AIDS ride twice. I told you about it. And the first time I was 25 years old. And
Yes.
the second time I was 50 years old. And the difference in just how the perception um, of AIDS when I first did it at 25, people were much more involved, I think, and much more willing to donate. And then when I hit 50, it was, people were like, that's still a thing. Like it
Yeah.
has, people don't realize that, yes, it's still a thing. And I think because there was so much fear around it before and unknowns. I mean, I remember my mom, I was a teenager, and my mom talking to me uh, about sex because she said, I know you're uncomfortable, but this is not about you getting pregnant or about you, it's not about you getting pregnant anymore. This could be life and death or death.
Right.
So it was
Yeah. I mean,
very,
the
yeah,
messages were not, it was a scary time.
yeah,
And, um, people did what they did. Some people panicked. Um, you know, June is is Pride Month
yes,
here in San Francisco and in a lot of other places, New York. And so we re and June 5th is actually Long-Term Survivor HIV and AIDS Awareness Day, HIV Long-Term Survivor Awareness Day. And so we kind of look back on a lot on these things. And I just remember the fear. I remember the disappointment. Like people that I knew, like I had a friend who was a doctor who said something that she could understand why why doctors wouldn't want to treat people with HIV. And, she didn't mean that. Actually, honestly, I didn't know at the time how she meant it, but I was just so taken aback that she would say something like that. Or, you'd be standing in somewhere and people would talk about people with HIV like you weren't in the room, like they weren't aware, and say things like, well, I wouldn't want to date someone with HIV because I don't want to, waste my time because they're going to die. It's like they often referred to people living with HIV as being disposable. And being in your 20s, that's a really hard thing to hear, you know. The other piece that, that this brings up for me is that well, we might even get into this later, but given the current political environment, so much of this is resurfacing, things that people didn't think about for a long time. In 1996, when the effective treatments came out, highly hard. I won't even try to say it. It's like it's a tongue twister. But it saved my life, and it meant that we would live, not without some complications, but it was almost like, everybody was just so relieved to be past that. So just take your pills and be quiet. Let's just not talk about it anymore. And I don't think anybody ever envisioned that we might be going through this again.
Yep.
And that, this our government's refusal to take the science into account and to realize how important it is to, because HIV is like, I think if it was 1981, so we're looking at 44 years, and that's kind of middle age, it's kind of like it's still a fairly young condition, and it could go it could go any way. And so the fact that, we're not maintaining the science, that we're not keeping up with what happens could really mean that we are going to see another pandemic, possibly worse than what we saw before because of resistant strains, because of how it's spread. Um, so it's a little scary, and we would never wish what we went through on another generation, but it's a possibility. And more of the people that I work with and serve in my programs, are talking about the same thing. Like, are we going to die of AIDS actually? Did we dodge that bullet only to have it come back and be let down by our country yet again? And this time it's not just our country. You know, um, there's a lot of talk about what's going to happen with PEPFAR, which is the president's HIV/AIDS fund that's provides medications internationally. If that goes away, what's going to happen to those people in the countries who rely on us? So it's quite complicated, and much more than we can probably get into in the overtime that we have for conversation. But it is scary. And it's one of the reasons why I commit to do these talks so that we can share and talk about our experiences, because sometimes the people can put a face or have a story that they can connect to or somehow see how this might impact their lives. I find that that's really the best way to educate folks and raise this kind of awareness.
Definitely. And you speak about the changes in 1980s, 1990s, and now I know we've said that you've been living with this for over 40 years, and just that sentence, I've been living with HIV for nearly 40 years. Very few people could imagine even saying that in the 1980s
Yeah.
and the 1990s. How has your understanding of life and death evolved through these decades? You must have a very different view. I know in my 2 years of doing my work, I've completely changed. So I can only
Yeah.
imagine.
Well, it was unthought of. It was not a possibility back then. It's like it was a death sentence. And I remember, I think it was 2006, ABC, the national network, did a story on three people. I was one of them, and they called us long-term survivors. And, at that point, I think it was like 15 years or something. And I thought, wow, what a strange thing to call people. And then here it is, it's been 20 years after that, almost 20 years, and truly long-term survivor, truly a long-term survivor. And my I think I've softened up a lot. One of the things that my partner Jesse, who passed away in October of 1991, told me, that I need to think in terms of possibility and have some hope, like think not about what I can't do or what I couldn't do, but what can I do in the time that I have available to me. And so, death is a possibility. That was in a poem that he wrote. But love is real. Life, which is the experience that we share in this planet, on this planet, is real. And to focus on that. And so in my work, the founding premise of my department is, what is the world that you want to age into, and what are you doing to get there? And I found that for this particular time, to go back to what we did in the 80s and 90s, where we got people thinking about how they'd like to live their final days. Where do you want to be? What do you want? I remember in the early 2000s, I attended some seminar, and it was about death. And they talked about, a person is born, you have this year, mine for me, that's 1961. And then there's a dash, and then there is the year that you finally left the planet or transitioned. And they said the most interesting part of that person's life is that little dash.
Mm.
And, you may never know what is there. And so it's like, what do you want to fill your dash with? What are the things? And also, what's the story that you want to tell? And so, I try to use these different premises with the people that I work with. And, we work with a lot of trans and gender nonconforming folks, and they are going through an even tougher time than a lot of the folks because of what's happening. And one of the things that, one of my staff brought to me is like, Vince, our participants are saying that when one of them dies, they have to hope that a bar will loan them a space for an hour so they can have some kind of memorial. And if they don't get that, then the person just kind of, fades. And so I was like, well, we can see how we can change that. So we started introducing some of the deaf doula work, which I realized was very similar to what they did with us back when there were no treatment options. And, I remember I wanted to be a healer. And I
Mm.
started doing a bunch of different things like that. And I thought, well, I don't know about that. I did some theater work to do education, which I found was incredible because it taught me about the value of people's lived experience and telling their stories. And then, I basically kind of settled on the sort of activism role that I'm doing. And my activism is, yes, there's policy, there's all these things, but it's like I want people to have a better life. I just told someone this the other day, that a life is a precious thing to waste, and you only get one. So how do you want, And I've tried over the course of time, I've tried to encourage people because I can't tell you how many memorial services I went to where people would get up one after the other to talk about how much they loved the person who had passed. And I was thinking, why didn't they tell them this when they were alive? So many of my clients died not knowing how people truly felt about them. So in my work, I try to figure out ways that we can have people be appreciated. We celebrate birthdays. We look forward to the holidays, and how do we want to, we have an annual dinner, and we usually go to the Central Gay Men's Chorus for their Christmas Eve concert. One of my guys said, you know what? I don't celebrate Christmas. I said, well, you don't come, I don't think they're going to change the program for you, but you can come and enjoy our company and have dinner. And like, if you want to do that, great. If not, we'll see you next year. And he's come every year. After that, he comes and he sits down and he enjoys. It's the company of community, having a feeling, a place to belong.
Especially now, it is
Yeah,
so important for everyone, but especially for the LGBTQ
yeah.
community. It is just it if you do not have the right support, it could be devastating. And so getting that support and really wherever you find that support, wherever you find your community is so important.
Right. And, one of the things with my generation of LGBTQ, and now they have an I and a plus and a lot of other letters, but, we didn't have traditional families. We had chosen families. A lot of us, except in San Francisco, maybe and possibly New York, the relationships were a secret. Many folks didn't have children. And, one of the things, and this just came out literally 10 minutes before we came, I joined this. One of my active members called me to tell me that they were going to have to put their support animal down
They were going to
today.
have what? I'm sorry.
Put their support animal, have him euthanized. And that is a place, pets are wonderful support. It's a program called Pause here. And so many of our folks had these animals who just became like family to them. And every time one of them loses one, it's just like we lost a family member. And that just, um, yeah. And I told him, I'm going to be taping a podcast, but if you need something, please reach out to, my staff, and we will try to figure out how we can support you. And if I don't hear from you, I'll check in with you tomorrow. Um, but I remember um, when he first came, I can say the name, right, of the animal?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, it's Heidi. And Heidi, literally every event that we have, Heidi shows up, and I might get a little choked up. Shows up, and we did a show called Still Here, a theater production. Heidi upstaged everyone. It's like,
Of course
you know,
she did.
they tell you don't try to compete with an animal, but she's a little white, just adorable um little animal, and it just breaks my heart to know that we won't be seeing her on Saturdays or at our community dinners anymore. But
Heidi,
you know,
dog or cat or
a dog. A dog, just a sweet. Well, actually, I should say she was pretty feisty. I mean, there were times she was like a guard dog as well as, but she provided, and I know he wouldn't mind me saying this. His name is Homer. Provided Homer with so much support, and there were certain people in our group that Heidi just loved and would just grab. I was one of them. Like I'd be trying to talk to somebody, and Heidi would be like pulling my pants legs. And so, yeah, there's this, and even though Heidi wasn't, was I would say they were chosen family, I also feel like it's my loss as well.
yeah, and I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for it's when when you're I hate to call them a call dogs cats pets because there's so much more that
Yeah,
that word just doesn't do what animals in our lives are. It doesn't do justice. But it is more, I think, more devastating a lot of times
yeah.
than.
It's an unconditional love, and so many of our folks never knew that. Many of us did, had a special partner, something like that, but many folks did not. And so to have this and find that kind of companionship. And I think that no matter who you are, to have that in your life, particularly at a time when maybe you might be alone, is just an incredible gift if you can find the right person. I always look at the animal adoption. I don't have a pet myself, but I always look at the animal adoptions just to see who's, and always there's a story that touches me in particular. I always wish them well and hope they find someone. They're forever home.
I don't know how you can go and visit. Let me tell you, if I go to those places, I walk out with another family member. I have three cats. My husband's allergic. He is a saint for dealing with the three cats. Let me tell you. And of course, they love him. When we go to bed at night, they pile on him.
Mm.
So they're the one who's allergic, of course.
Wow. Yeah. So I do a lot of house sitting for my friends and their pets, so that's how I get my pet fixes. My job doesn't really loan itself because I'm gone a lot. I travel a lot and I'm gone a lot, so and I'm like often gone during the day, so I don't think it's totally fair. But anyway, I'm glad I got to pay tribute to Heidi in this and just to all support animals everywhere because they are so important and they are family and they provide such a gift to their owners.
Yeah. Well, if you're willing, or if Homer's willing to give a picture, I'll be more than happy while this goes on
Okay, I'll
to
let him know.
send
I
it.
think he would love that. And then,
Wonderful.
yeah, I think he would love that.
So when you think about your own, since we're talking about end of life, or we started talking about end of life, how do you see yourself, or how do you want to be supported? Yeah, how do you want to be supported, given that we have? Yeah, I know that we talked about family and what that really means, and chosen family.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot different. A chosen family, uh, that bond is really very close. Not that regular family isn't close, but there is
Yeah.
a different, you choose between a chosen family and being born into a family and the kind of support you get.
Yeah. So, in my program, which is called, well, my department's called Aging Services, but I had this program called the Elizabeth Taylor 50 Plus Network. And we've all kind of become sort of chosen family. Like during COVID, people were surprised that people would call and check in on them to see how they were doing. And so most likely, my mom and dad, my dad passed in 2020. My mom's in a nursing facility. She has dementia. So it's not likely that she would be able to take care of me. But I definitely know I want to be cremated and I want my ashes taken back and spread in the ocean in Guam.
Mm.
It's like even though San Francisco's been my home, I always feel I've known that forever from the moment that I thought death was a possibility, that that's what I wanted. In fact, when Jesse passed, my partner, his family wanted to have a traditional, so he has a plot that he's buried in New York, but I actually took some of his belongings and brought them to Guam, and um, we we burned them in a fire. There's a place called Two Lovers Point, and the legend was that these two lovers were forbidden to be together. But in the end, they tied their hair together. They were a heteronormative couple, but the legend was they tied their hair together and they jumped over this cliff. And so we call it Two Lovers Point. So anyway, so I brought Jesse's belongings that I brought and we burned them and we watched, and then all of a sudden this wind came and kind of created this sort of circular thing, lifted up the ashes out of the fire and took them over the fence because we were like, how are we going to get the ashes over the fence? Because it's like it's not going to go very far. But the wind took care of it. It just picked it up and brought it, and it was like my cousin Terry
Mm.
goes, "Oh my God." He's like, that's magical. I said, yeah, it's so interesting just to see that the whole thing. And so for me, that's what I want. And my father, I had a conversation. I remember this so vividly. It was December 9th, um, 2019. COVID had not hit yet, but I talked with my parents about what they wanted. And my dad had shared with me at one time that he also wanted to be cremated and have his ashes brought back to Guam. And so I asked him if that's what he still wanted. And he's like, I'm going to be dead, right? And it's like, yes, Dad, we would not cremate you while you were still alive. And he's like, I don't care. I'm going to be dead. Do what you want. I'm like, but Dad, I need you to commit to something so I can, so I can fulfill your wishes. And I just always said that was so funny. My mother was very clear she wanted to have a traditional burial and whatever. And then she also said she didn't want my dad to be with her, which was kind of hurtful. But, I had to facilitate that, de-escalate, and talk to my dad. He was so funny. And it was interesting that night too, because for the first time, my parents and we talked about their childhoods of them growing up on Guam. And I knew some of the history, but I didn't realize that they'd lived in concentration camps. The Japanese came in and tried to, it was around, and I didn't realize that. And we talked about that, and they both had stories. And I thought, why did we never talk about this before? Why are we waiting till it's, like you are in your 80s and we're finally having this conversation? I thought, well, maybe it's something they didn't want to talk about. But at the same time, I kind of start to understand a lot of knowing now what I know about trauma, and trauma-informed care and how that impacts folks. It really kind of opened up my eyes, but I always thought my dad's conversation about being cremated was funny.
That is funny. Well, at least your parents can talk about it, can talk
Yes.
about death. I can tell you from experience, not all parents, mine included, will talk about death.
It's so one of my friends, whose name I won't say because I didn't ask if it was okay for me to share about this, but talked about how they were so angry at their parents for kind of putting everything in place and having instructions and whatever. But then when something actually happened, they were so grateful
Yep.
because they did not have to think about this and everything was intentional. Everything was the way that they want. And they were so grateful and they were just able to spend the time to kind of be close, to kind of be at peace. Um, just it was just I said, how could being that she worked in the same field that I do, I said, how could you not know that this is the way to go?
It,
But you have sometimes it takes that personal thing for you to be able to connect, like, now I get it.
yeah, yeah. And thank you for saying that because I always tell people, one of the greatest gifts you can give your family is to have all that, write down all of your passwords, your utility bills, like take care of all of that beforehand so that your family can focus on being a family, being together and
Yes.
grieving. And it is a gift. It is the last thing people want to deal with when they're grieving is the bank, right?
Right. Or if you have unsettled business, it all services during that time, and sometimes you can't get anything done because you have unfinished, and the siblings are arguing with each other, they're not in agreement, and that's been challenging. There's other things like for some folks, who were strained from their families. We had to think about, so um, that brother that you don't like, unless you make it explicit, he will get all the money that you have in your bank account. Even if it's not much, because he is a relative and he's your only relative, he will be the one to get that unless you state otherwise. And even if you do state otherwise, sometimes because of legality and different states' policies and stuff like that, it still might be a struggle because they could challenge it. But the more that you can have in writing, the more that you can be clear that this is your wishes. Have witnesses do whatever, have it notarized, have several copies. But be ready because otherwise, I had a client, this is in the 90s, but he was so afraid of his family finding out that he was gay. So he actually avoided them for years. And his relatives, he was from another country, but his nieces came to visit him and he wouldn't see them because he didn't want them to know that he was sick or question, what had happened. So anyway, he passed. And it was so sad because I heard from his volunteer who took care of him, that when he died, on the box where they shipped his ashes, they wrote AIDS. And that was just so heartbreaking because he spent so, it was very clear to me that his family cared about him because they were trying to connect with him, but I couldn't intervene because that wasn't my business. But I remember trying to coach him to kind of, have the option of maybe being open to talking to them. And he's like, no, I can't do it. And then in the end, and so that's another thing. I think you asked me a question earlier, what have I learned? It's like we can't control a lot of this. We can have our best intentions, but there's so many things we can't control. But if you have it written down and you have a clear plan of action, then chances are your wishes are going to be respected much more than if you just leave it to chance.
We're going to pause the conversation here. I hope something in this conversation spoke to you, and I'd love for you to join me next week as we continue this journey. Until then, take good care of yourself.